Hey everybody, Stephen Clyde here, back for day 2 of War in the Middle East, and we're joined by my good friend Will Porter today. He's a freelance journalist and he's a super smart guy. Him and Kyle are two of the smartest guys next to Scott Horn in terms of foreign policy. So I've gotten really good feedback for yesterday's episode, and I'm super excited for today and the rest of the week. I hope you guys enjoy the show. The Peace and Liberty Podcast, episode 17. All right, Will, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Tell us a little about yourself before we get into the weeds of all this.
Yeah, sure. I'm a freelance journalist. I mostly write for antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute. I've written for several other places, Consortium News, the Daily Sheeple, several other outlets like that. But primarily, I'm at the Libertarian Institute. I mostly write about war and foreign policy. I've been doing that since, I think, 2014 or so a couple of years now.
Awesome. Yeah, you're highly recommended. When I told people you were coming on with me, they were like, oh, yeah, Will's the man. So, yeah, thanks for coming on. But today we're going to talk about Iraq, and I spent half an hour yesterday talking to Zach about Afghanistan and a basic overview of what's been going on there. A lot of manipulation by politicians, to say the least. But I guess start us off by talking about maybe the first Iraq War and how we got into that.
Yeah, sure. So the first, what is referred to the Gulf War, kicked off in 1991 under George H.W. Bush. And sort of the whole deal there was Saddam Hussein was accusing Kuwait of slant drilling under Iraqi reserves. And an American diplomat, April Glaspie, apparently gave Saddam the green light to go ahead and take care of the Kuwait situation however he wanted to. And then as soon as he did, he launched an invasion, and the United States, then used that as an excuse to then turn around and attack Iraq. And something I should say here, too, I'm going to say we a lot here, referring to the American government and military. I know the point that that's not us and stuff, but, it's just a grammatical thing. So forgive me. And so, yeah, effectively, we gave Saddam the green light to go ahead and go into Kuwait. And first thing we do is turn around and use that as a reason to attack him. And so that was basically the deal with the first Gulf War there.
Now, I was just listening to you on Zach's podcast, Foreign Policy Focus. I'm going to link to it. It was episode 115, and you're talking about the rise of ISIS. And you distinguish between ISIS, who is Sunni, and Al-Qaeda, who was led by Osama bin Laden. I think a lot of people get confused here. Maybe you can just kind of distinguish real quick and clear that up.
Yeah, certainly. And maybe we'll get a little bit more into this, too, when we kind of go through talking about the Iraq War. But the Islamic State is actually a breakoff group from regular vanilla Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was Osama bin Laden's group, and now led by Ayman al-Zawahiri. And Al-Qaeda of Iraq was actually the source of the Islamic State. And so the Islamic State originally was called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. That was led by a guy named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. However, ISIS, as you may have heard, is now led by a guy named Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. The leadership changes in these groups constantly. But effectively, yeah, ISIS began as a Al-Qaeda splinter in Iraq, and then it crossed over into Syria, and that's sort of when it changed its name officially to ISIS.
All right. So I guess going into this discussion, we're obviously going to cover a lot of years here, but I discussed in my intro that I remember when 9/11 happened, I must have been in like 3rd or 4th grade, and I was in a piano lesson, and my piano teacher was like, hey, I just heard about like some building crash or something, but she was saying in a way like the way you would say it to a third grader who wouldn't understand. Right. And everybody was freaking out. And I do remember the aftermath, but I was still a young kid. I don't know how old you are, but what do you remember from that time period? Because it was, the things that were being told to us, I think Democrats and Republicans are alike, were very, very pro-war after 9/11.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I was just a young kid too. I was probably, I was 10 years old in 2003. So I was probably like 8 when the September 11th attacks happened. And yeah, I remember too, a lot of kids being pulled out of class, and my weird little 8-year-old brain thought it had something to do with the West Nile virus or something. I remember distinctly thinking is there some sickness or something going around? But then I came home and saw, of course, the news, the images and stuff of the burning buildings. And yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, now that you mentioned sickness, we were just talking about this before. There was that big anthrax case just a few days after the 9/11 bombings. Do you think that's a conspiracy? I mean, that actually happened. People died from that.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely anthrax was sent out to people. There's no dispute there. It was sent to Thomas Daschle and Senator Leahy. Patrick Leahy, a couple American politicians. It's also sent to the offices of certain media offices. I forget if it was MSNBC or CNN or whatever. But man, there's so much to the anthrax thing. There was two different fall guys who they tried to blame for this. Neither of them seemed to have much to do with it. I think the first guy was named Hadley. The second guy was named Assad. The first guy ended up killing himself, but it's a very long kind of sordid, affair. But yeah, definitely anthrax attacks happened.
See, what I'm trying to wrap my head around is why Democratic senators? Why not don't Republicans perpetuate more war? Was it because they're angry from the aftermath of what Clinton did? Because me and Zach were just talking about this yesterday. Clinton very much was a wartime president, though he oftentimes is thought of a peacetime president.
Right, definitely. I mean, if you're talking about like Al-Qaeda itself, now it was never proved who actually did the anthrax attack. It was said that it was probably someone who had to, was tied in with the 9/11 plotters, but that was never proven at all. And in fact, you're asking about, was there a conspiracy involved here? And you mentioned, why did Democratic politicians get sent anthrax? And I think what some truthers have sort of suggested was that those politicians were particularly against the war. And so that may have been, if this was some big conspiracy, that may have been some attempt to make them, more pro-war, I guess. But I don't necessarily endorse that theory. It's just that's one of the things that's said about that.
Yeah, it's just totally bizarre. All right, so the Gulf War, August 1990 to February 1991. What was the aftermath of that? I mean, I guess what most people miss is that 9/11, all the anger that began with that led up to these plane attacks, that started way before that. And this starts in the Gulf War, and people forget that. So what was the aftermath of the Gulf War?
Right. And so after the Gulf War, after H.W. Bush got out of there, Bill Clinton didn't stop bombing Iraq. I think you and Kyle had actually talked about that. He didn't stop bombing Iraq. He levied bad sanctions on Iraq that got, if you've seen the clip with Madeleine Albright, 500,000 kids killed. And now I've seen things that sort of dispute those numbers, but nonetheless, it was hundreds of thousands of people were killed by those sanctions. And so that's sort of what provoked the 9/11 plotters and bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and stuff.
And that's always the worst argument. Like, was it 400,000 people or 500,000 people? Well, give me a break. Like, doesn't matter.
Right, one is too many if it's
just considering the circumstances. Yeah, but go ahead.
Right, certainly. So yeah, in the aftermath of the Gulf War, it certainly didn't really die down. It kind of petered out. But I think what happened during this time, as I'm saying, the stationing of American troops and military personnel in Saudi Arabia, what bin Laden would call the land of two holy places of Mecca and Medina, that was a major instigator for people like bin Laden. And then, of course, the hundreds of thousands of people that Bill Clinton killed and H.W. Bush in their campaigns in Iraq. So I think that's majorly like the fallout from that conflict was we stirred up these Al-Qaeda guys.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of people, it's easy to say that Obama was just Bush on steroids, but Bush was kind of just Clinton on steroids. But Bush wasn't exactly this first-time warmongering president. This has been going on for a long time. And in fact, I'm really not knowledgeable in a lot of the stuff. And in fact, this whole week, part of it's for me and part of it's for everybody else because I want to get a good knowledgeable experience out of it. But what happened with the Reagan-Iran-Contra? I just don't know anything about that. I haven't researched it. How does that relate to what we're going to talk about with Iraq?
Well, I don't have all the details at command for Iran-Contra, but just sort of the broad strokes was a communist revolution had taken place in Nicaragua and in Latin America. And the CIA was backing a group known as the Contras, which was the anti-Sandinista movement. And basically, we were backing a bunch of death squads. And so that's effectively what that amounted to. And so there was, arms deals with Iran to generate money to fund these Contras. And of course, there's also the whole angle of the drug smuggling too, which kind of ties into that as well. With Barry Seal and the Mena, Arkansas airport. And that also ties into Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton was the governor of Arkansas when all this cocaine smuggling was alleged to have happened.
It still happens, right?
Oh, yeah, I would think. I would imagine. I don't have necessarily any concrete proof that it's still happening that I know for a fact that, but I mean.
I read an article, it was probably a few months ago. Yeah, they caught a plane, just in the front of the plane, they found a bunch of cocaine. And yeah, I mean, who else could have put that there? Obviously, it was someone working with somebody, and it was most likely the government to have shipped that quantity on the nose of a plane. I'll try to look that up later, but anyway, I guess we'll try to dive into Iraq. So Iraq War II. We invaded March 20th, and I remember this clear as day. I remember this vividly. I was in my elementary school classroom. It was 5th grade, and I went to a private school, so I was in like 5th grade. So I just transferred to a new public school. I was the first time in public school, and then obviously public school ruined me. Public school's terrible. I wish I stayed in private school, but I remember the teacher got up in front of the class and was like, we've just went to war. And I remember her face. It wasn't just what she said. It was just like how she said it. Just like, man, I have to tell this to a bunch of like 11-year-olds. How do I do this? Because everybody's talking about it. Everybody's talking about it. People, you know, you can't. Everybody's watching the news, and it was just a horrifying time. But yeah, I was also watching this clip that you showed me earlier. And it had this little clip. It was with Paul Wolfowitz, and he was talking to Lincoln Shaffey, I think his name was. And Shaffey was just destroying him and talking about, like, what the hell are we doing there? And the responses given, I'll link to the video later, but the responses were so crazy. I don't even remember them. They were just so crazy.
Yeah, Lincoln Chafee was actually, I think he ran, I forget if it was the last election, but he was like one of the best Democrats on foreign policy for a while there. And so that's all I know about Lincoln Chafee is that he's solid on foreign policy. So it doesn't surprise me.
He was actually a Republican at that time too. I guess he was one of the people standing. Yeah. In that interview, that was July 29th, 2003. If anyone wants to look up the interview, Paul Wolfowitz was the Deputy Defense Secretary. And man, his excuses were pretty shoddy.
Yeah, Wolfowitz is bad, man. He's part of the group of, like, we can get into this too, of neoconservatives. Like, a lot of the time that word is thrown around to just mean like a hawkish right-winger, but it's kind of a biographical title. It means something specific. A lot of these neoconservatives come from, like, their former, at least the theorists of the movement. They're second and third generations now. But, like, the original neoconservatives were former leftists, former Trotskyite anti-Stalinists. And they joined the Democratic Party, and then the Democratic Party was too soft on communism, so they became Republicans. And under, what's his name? Scoop Jackson, the senator from Boeing. And so yeah, the neoconservatives, Paul Wolfowitz is definitely part of that tradition there.
I think, I see a Rothbard shirt behind you. I got to applaud you on that. But I think Rothbard talked about that in Betrayal of the American Right, just how, you know, the old right versus the new right. Yeah, I mean, neoconservative does have a definition. But I guess you have a bunch of notes written down in front of you. I guess just however you want to direct this conversation. I guess what people really want to know is, you know, what actually happened over there, like maybe more specific examples, because people know we went over there. They know we were supposed to find weapons of mass destruction. We supposedly didn't find any, but some people say we did. You know, there was that whole thing. I remember when I was a kid, what my parents would say is, yeah, the government is saying that satellites can detect these weapons of mass destruction. And I was 11, 12 years old. You know, I was just starting to understand, you know, real world things. So yeah, maybe talk about some of those things.
Sure. I guess I could just kind of lay out some of the basic, like, you know, when it happened and stuff, and then build up to some of the more important points.
Great.
And so, as your viewers may know, we invaded in March of 2003, and this is all over. They sort of parlayed the 9/11 attacks, but you'd see that there's sort of multiple justifications here. It started as being the 9/11 attacks. That was, of course, the original. Like, everyone probably thinks that that's why we went there. It has something to do with 9/11, right? I mean, it happened right pretty soon after that. However, as they also know, as you mentioned, there's the whole weapons of mass destruction narrative. So, like, which was it? Was it that Saddam was an ally of Al-Qaeda and was part of the 9/11 plot, or WMD? And it was all of the above. And then, of course, once the WMD thing started to fall away, they started talking about democracy promotion. And so, yeah, to continue with what I was saying, invaded March 2003, and we didn't do it unilaterally. We went in with they called the multinational force. And that was the UK, Australia, of course, the United States, Spain, and Poland. And I think others eventually joined in. However, for like the conventional war aspect of the Iraq War, just like waging war against Saddam's regime and his military, that was over very quickly, actually. That was over within, Saddam had fallen by April and they had captured him by December of 2003. And so,
right. That's literally the first sentence of Scott Horn's book of chapter 1 is that, you know, when we went into, when we, or sorry, I don't know if I'm messing up time. So when we initially invaded, there were only a few hundred Al-Qaeda members. And, you know, now looking into the future, there's thousands and thousands. So like what happened there? That's kind of a weird coincidence.
Right. That is certainly true what you're saying about, like, there was only a couple hundred Al-Qaeda guys. And today, after 15 years of the terror war, there are tens of thousands.
Right.
However, with Saddam, it was just a matter of, it's just kind of strange that, you know, we had won this war effectively, the conventional aspect of it, just fighting Saddam's troops within a year. And so why, you know, I think we can get into why did we end up staying for so long and sort of the blunders of that. And so after Saddam had been overthrown, a couple big things happened there. There was an incident in 2004, a year after we invaded, in Fallujah. And you may have heard of this, where Blackwater contractors, 4 of them, had been killed and dragged behind trucks and hung from bridges and stuff. And sort of that was just a... I
was young at that age. I don't remember that. I'm going to look that up.
Oh, yeah, certainly. There's a massacre of American contractors in Fallujah. And I think that's just sort of emblematic of how we waged the war, of our counterinsurgency and how we occupied the place. I think Scott Horton mentions in his book, in Fool's Errand, that the Fallujah massacre was motivated by an Israeli assassination of a guy named Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And that was a Hamas leader. However, the other half of it was the way the Americans were conducting themselves, occupying Fallujah. One had told a reporter that it was all about American aggression. That was part of the reason. And so I think the more important stuff of the Iraq War, the more sort of significant points come well after we had toppled Saddam and well after he had been, I think he was executed in 2005. And so it sort of comes in two aspects, I guess. You had sort of the nation building attempts, and you had the counterinsurgency. And you can see that's separate from defeating Saddam's army and taking the capital of Baghdad. That had been done. That was well over with. And we decided to stay and to do these things, this counterinsurgency and this nation building. And so that's really, I think, where the majority of our problems have come from. And so one of the major things we did in Iraq was we backed Shia parties, Shia-friendly parties, such as the Dawa Party or SCIRI, the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. And these are basically Iranian parties, Iranian-backed parties, who some of them even came over the border from Iran and to Iraq. And perhaps something I should mention, too, is that Iraq is sort of an outlier in the Muslim world in that the Shia there are the majority, whereas in the rest of the Muslim world, the Sunnis are like the 80% majority everywhere. I think the only exceptions are like Bahrain and Iran, but Iran isn't an Arab society, so it's different.
Hey, by the way, this is why we have you on, because this is interesting. This is all fascinating. Keep going.
Right. Yeah. It's good to know these demographics because we took the side of the Shia in Iraq. And it's funny, you'll often hear American politicians and other, NATO people, you'll hear them complain about, Iranian influence and how, there's something called the Shia Crescent. Well, okay, if you look and see who the groups that we backed in Iraq, there's no question why there's Iranian influence in Iraq now. It has everything to do with overthrowing the Sunni regime of Saddam, who was not a fan of Iran, obviously. They fought a war in the 80s and replaced them with Iranians, basically. And I should also note, Saddam Hussein he wasn't like a religious leader or something. He's pretty secular. You can see he didn't have a big bushy beard or didn't wear religious garb. It's not like he was an Ayatollah. He was a secular Ba'athist socialist kind of guy. And so, I guess one thing I was going to ask is, like, Bush Sr. did the same exact thing. Is like he propped up the Shiites and Kurds and kind of like left them to rot, and they got crushed. So I don't know if you're about to lead into that. Is this basically what we did over again? Well, yeah, that was like the reason why the Bush administration had changed the H.W. Bush administration, because you're right, they did tell the Kurds and the Shia, go ahead and revolt against Saddam, and we're going to support you. We got your back. And then right at the last minute, they went forward with the revolt, and then the Bush administration said, we're not going to, they pulled support and just let these Iraqis get slaughtered. And then terribly, they used that slaughtering as a new excuse for why Saddam is so dangerous and can't be tolerated. However, the reason the H.W. Bush administration decided not to go through with that is precisely because of the kind of civil strife you would have saw if you would have put Shia in power there. It's simply, it's funny. There's actually an old interview of Dick Cheney. I can probably find it. You can put it in the show notes.
Yeah, we're going to link to a lot in this episode, by the way.
Yeah, there's a lot of links, a lot of things to be linked to. And so Cheney is asked, this is before 2003, before the second Iraq War. Cheney is asked, why didn't H.W. Bush go through with overthrowing Saddam? And Cheney gives this amazing response, like something that you or I would say, like, well, once you overthrow Saddam, pieces of Iraq start kind of flying off, and there's all this chaos and sectarian strife. And so it's just not a good idea. It's funny. That's a great reason. Yeah, that's exactly why you shouldn't overthrow Saddam. And that's exactly what we did. And not only did we just overthrow him and it happened to be that Shia took power, we actively helped them, we helped to enfranchise them. And so I think one of the major results of enfranchising the Shia in Iraq at the expense of the Sunnis was sort of the cleansing of Sunnis out of major cities such as Baghdad. And this gets into the second part of what I wanted to talk about is the counterinsurgency, because by siding with the Shia over the Sunni, we effectively drove a lot of the Sunni population into the arms of insurgents like Al-Qaeda, and sort of drove them out of major cities like Baghdad out into the west, into the Anbar province, which is kind of like crappy desert. Like there's no oil wealth out there. There's no resources. And so the Sunnis were basically all marginalized out into the west, whereas the Shia took the capital city and the Kurds had a lot of the oil wealth. And so this would empower a group called Al-Qaeda in Iraq, led by, as I mentioned earlier, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. And am I going too fast? Is there anything
Oh no, I just want to confirm one thing real quick. So you mentioned the 80% Sunni population.
Yeah.
Compared from like now compared to like 25 years ago, is it about the same, or was there a population shift at all?
No, I think the demographics have largely been like I think Iraq has been sort of like a Shia sanctuary or something. Like the city of Karbala, for example, has a lot of like religious relics and shrines. There's a big Shia community there, and so I think the Shia largely had been the majority in Iraq. And
Because
that's not
it seems throughout all this, it's hard to tell. Like, are we friends with people? Are we enemies with people? It seems like we're kind of both at once at the same time. It's all super bizarre. That's the most bizarre part about war and everything. It's like that's why Scott Horn's book is like 1,500 sources, and his next book's probably gonna be more because it's just so much to cover. How do you piece all this together? Well, I don't think one person could. It's just you try to develop the best theories you can based on the evidence.
Yeah, it's kind of hard. It's very arbitrary because there's no easy formula that just says the U.S. backs the Sunnis always or backs the Shia always or whatever. It's back and forth all the time. So in the 1980s, the United States backed Saddam Hussein in his war against Iran, and so that's like the complete opposite situation, helping Saddam fight the Iranians. And of course, there were American hostages being held in Iran at the time, so there's some reasons for that. But 20 years later, we're overthrowing Saddam in favor of the Iran-backed Shia, and so it's very kind of it is. You're right. It is confusing to try to keep up with like which factions we're currently backing. But it is still the case that like the Shia-backed, like it's largely the Shia-backed government that we installed in Iraq that's still there under Hyder al-Abadi.
I think that's hard for people to swallow because I think by saying that it sounds like we're bashing the troops. Well, no, we're bashing the policy. I mean, my grandfather, for example, he joined the Marines when he was about like 17. He had no choice. I think he was setting up pins in a bowling alley, but the Marines took him in. It did benefit him, but I don't know what he had to see in war. I've never met him, but point being, a lot of people go into it maybe for the right reasons, but God, I mean, it's kind of like, is there such thing as a good cop? Well, there are cops that do good things, but you ultimately sign up to do, you sign up to be, you sign yourself over as property, and that's problematic. And obviously we're both against conscription. All this is very difficult to decipher. What do we actually do about this? I mean, obviously we would just like to pull out right away, but getting back into like Iraq, I mean, you're going to talk about like counterinsurgency and stuff.
Yeah, if you'll just permit a brief digression, I think
Yeah,
you
go
made
ahead.
a good point there about like other and people who joined the military. People in California joined the Marine Corps and the Army when New York was attacked. New York is very far away from California, and so just to sort of expand that point, it shouldn't be hard to see why a Saudi like Osama bin Laden gets mad when Iraqis are murdered. It's not like it should be easy. If a Californian can get mad when New Yorkers are killed, then Saudis can get mad when Iraqis are killed. Just to sort of make that point.
Yeah, I mean, there very much was the kind of mentality that, people were so shook up. It's just, let's blow them up.
Right.
Let's
Yeah,
blow them up.
certainly don't blame the troops like at all. They're often duped and lied to, and they're disposable and all this stuff. Now, some troops do, go overboard and commit atrocities and stuff, and they deserve responsibility. They should, be held responsible. But
It's hard to pinpoint because I don't know how it is. If you're given an order to kill, what happens if you don't do it? I mean, I wouldn't argue that, they would dispose of you, but I'm not saying it never happened. I don't know what happened. You're required to take orders. I'll just give you, just to digress for 1 second. I used to work with a guy in Ace Hardware, and he used to be in the Navy. He told me about a time where he got an ear infection, and he was scared. He did not want to tell his commander because, it just would have been a big hassle. So he hid it for a while. And the commander came up to him one day and noticed it and was like, son, you are government property and you are destroying government property. And the way he looked in my eye and told me that, he wasn't kidding at all. By not taking care of his ear infection, he was destroying government property. So think about what a soldier is in that context.
Right, certainly. Yeah, they're very expendable, to be sure. It's
Yeah.
like to be treated as property.
Just to let you know, we got about 10 minutes left. Sorry, we got about 10 minutes left. So yeah, let's get into it.
Sure. Yeah, I'll try to get through this. I know it's a lot of information to cover, and perhaps we can discuss more of it at another time. It's so much. We're covering the last 25 years of history here. So
I'm having you on tomorrow too. I forgot to mention I'm having you on tomorrow too. So yeah, maybe we can start tomorrow and just kind of recap, and we'll get into. I think we're gonna do me and you're gonna do Syria tomorrow, and also me and Kyle we're gonna record Yemen tomorrow.
Yeah, and actually Syria would be perfect to follow this because Iraq really leads directly into Syria.
That was Kyle's suggestion.
Hell yeah, perfect then.
All right, go ahead, man.
So I think where I left off, I left off, we're saying we empowered the Shia parties and we disenfranchised the Sunnis, driving them to the arms of the insurgency of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq is led by a guy named Zarqawi. Zarqawi was a Jordanian. He came and set up shop in Iraq about a year after our invasion, pretty much solely because of our invasion. He came to Iraq to foment, to play a part of that sectarian divide between Sunni and Shia, to drive people into his arms, and to fight the Americans, to kill him some GIs. And so Zarqawi's group is super brutal, like way more brutal than other Al-Qaeda factions. There's even correspondence between Zawahiri, then the #2 in Al-Qaeda, telling Zarqawi, like, man, we like what you're doing and everything, but the killing of Muslims and the bombing of marketplaces, like, maybe tone that down. And so obviously pretty brutal dude when the #2 in Al-Qaeda is telling you, like, chill out a little bit. So Zarqawi is killed in 2006, and the Al-Qaeda of Iraq changes its name to the Islamic State of Iraq. And then it's taken over by a guy named al-Masri, who's an Egyptian. And something to note here is just like Al-Qaeda in Iraq was largely run by foreigners, Zarqawi, the Jordanian, al-Masri, the Egyptian. And by the time Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi took over, that sort of like his name, his title there, that's why he chose that. It's like, I'm Iraqi, unlike these other guys. Like, so you listen to me.
And just to clarify, Islamic State, is that the same thing as ISIS, or are those two separate factions?
No, that's the same deal.
Okay, okay.
Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, or however you want. Some people call it ISIL too. But yeah, gotcha. Islamic State, same deal. And so this group that arose in Iraq, as a result largely of our policies, our invasion, our sort of de-Baathification of Baghdad, the result of that is the rise and the empowerment of Al-Qaeda in Iraq. And by 2010, this is when Baghdadi takes over AQI. And within 4 years, they launched their big blitzkrieg to take all this territory. They took Mosul, they eventually took Tikrit and Ramadi and stuff. And I'm sure you remember this, the Islamic State. And so I just think it's important to drive that point home that, like, the Islamic State didn't just come out of nowhere. This is a group that had a precursor in Iraq, and they rose specifically in response to our invasion of that country. And so when people say things, you hear truthers say stuff like, we founded ISIS, or Obama started ISIS, or Bush started ISIS. That's a little simplistic to say that, but yeah, if you go through all the facts and stuff, largely, yeah, we pretty much did. As a result of our policies, that's what we got was the Islamic State. And so you can trace this clear line from Al-Qaeda in Iraq to ISIS. And this all began with the 2003 invasion. And then I think when you get into the Syrian thing, we can kind of talk about how the Obama administration then doubled down and supported the same group, and that when they really expanded into Syria and became ISIS. And so I'm not sure how much time we have left if we wanted to get into that.
We got about 5 minutes left. Before you go on, I said this quote yesterday, and this is quoting Omar, which is Osama bin Laden's son. My father's dream was to bring the Americans to Afghanistan. He would do the same thing he did to the Russians. I was surprised America took the bait. When Bush was elected, my father was so happy. This is the kind of president he needs. One who will attack and spend money and break the country. I'm sure my father wanted John McCain more than Obama in the 2008 election. McCain has the same mentality as Bush. So if we look at the things people like Osama bin Laden actually said, we get a glimpse of their actual intentions. But when you talk to people, when you talk to the neoconservatives, it's like, we don't even want to look at what they say. We just want to kind of create this other narrative and go off that. And that seems like pretty much what we do. It's just insane. How do we not look at the direct quotes and the things like that?
Well, I would say to any neocon or neocon fellow traveler or whatever, I would cite them. I would refer them to Michael Scheuer. That's the former head of the CIA's bin Laden unit. They call that Alex Station. And Michael Scheuer says, you better listen to what your enemies have to say. You better not ignore what their grievances and their arguments and stuff. It doesn't mean you're sympathizing. It doesn't mean that I'm sympathizing with Osama bin Laden when I say, hey, listen, that he wanted us to invade. That was his whole goal. The whole goal with drawing the Soviets in Afghanistan was to give them their Vietnam, sort of. And that's what a former Carter advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said. And he was all indignant about it. Like, what would you prefer? A bunch of stirred up Muslims or the evil empire of the Soviet Union? Like, of course it's fine to have. But I mean, if you ask that same question today, I don't think those stirred up Muslims, I don't think that's such a trivial thing. It's obviously pretty important. Thousands of people are dying in relation to that. Yeah,
I mean, they would have been mad either way. Yeah, obviously, Islam is a religion. If you take it to the extreme, it's very, very violent. But, out of a population of over 1 billion Muslims, I think one driving point was just that a lot of the people that participate in these terrorist attacks, they're upper middle class, they're educated, These people know what they're doing. They're very conscious of what they're doing. So, I mean, the whole situation's crazy. A lot of it's just backwards intuition. You wouldn't think about it this way unless you actually did some of the research. And do you think a lot of people do this research? No, they don't. So, we're almost out of time. I don't know if you just want to do like a brief recap, and we'll wrap it up, and we'll do it all again tomorrow.
Yeah, sure. So just to recap what I said, we invaded Iraq in the wake of the September 11th attacks, partially because of the attacks, partially because of this WMD thing. We can maybe get into more of the lead up of that at another time. But the major, we had pretty much won the war, mission accomplished within like a year of the thing. But yet we insisted on staying to do this nation building and to do this counterinsurgency. And it seemed like the nation building with the picking the winners and the parties, that drove the insurgency. And so it was sort of we're working at cross purposes there. And
now,
so we drove this insurgency into existence that eventually became the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. So perhaps that's a good takeaway for your audience.
Gotcha. And yeah, tomorrow we're going to get into Syria, and that's going to be fun. So yeah, thank you so much, Will, for coming on. Love having both you educated guys talking about this stuff. We could talk for hours, but I try to do about like 30-minute shows to keep them short. But we're going to see you tomorrow, man. Thank you so much for coming on.
All right. I appreciate it. Appreciate you having me.
All right. Well, we're going to do Syria tomorrow. Have a good one. Hey, everyone. Please like, follow, donate, subscribe, and share. Any donations will be used to reach more people.